I recently saw that the debate about whether the ideology of the Nazis should be classified as left-wing or right-wing has come up again. So I thought I would finally make a video about the underlying structure of political ideologies. The argument about which wing the Nazis should be assigned to, especially in combination with the binary worldviews where one is either left or right, is rather a way of telling the other side that one sees oneself on the side of the good guys and the other on the side of the bad guys. So the aim here is to analyze the political division and to decode the matrix of mental possibilities, to such an extent that everyone who has seen and understood this video understands more about the political conflict between left and right than 99.9% of the population. I don't claim that everything I say is always right, and I don't have to be, because it's about universal patterns that people have to recognize for themselves, instead of learning them from words. Then people can also recognize one-sided thoughts and statements themselves. I'm not interested in presenting solutions, I'm interested in presenting a formula that can be used to find solutions. And it's also about trying to get the left and the right to meet again in a friendly and unbiased way. So this video is primarily about political visions and why some people classify the Nazis as left-wing and others as right-wing. This has to do with the binary categories that people use to define their worldview. Right and left are two terms that can be understood completely differently by left-wing and right-wing people. So what is it even, left and right? First of all, they are symbols, so written words. Then a sound that can be heard when the word is pronounced. But that's not really the point. The word and symbol only serve to symbolize and communicate meanings. And that is where a problem arises. A symbol can have several meanings. Basically, any meaning can be assigned to a symbol. Let's imagine we have two test groups. Then we come up with two terms, Gnarf and Plumbus. One group is told that Gnarf means to protect life and Plumbus means to destroy life. The other group is told that Plumbus means to protect life and Gnarf means to destroy life. Then they are sent into a room and the question arises about whether they think Gnarf or Plumbus is morally right. One then says Gnarf and the other says Plumbus. Both then have an inverted perception of the meaning of what has been said and think the other is a bad person. They heard the same sounds and saw the same symbols, but in the world behind the mask, there are two different interpretations of the underlying meaning of the event. However, when they talk more, the misunderstanding is quickly cleared up, as protecting life and destroying life are two very clear concepts and were simply defined in reverse. But there are other concepts that are more difficult to understand. Protecting life and destroying life are two very clear and recurring ideas around which the search for ethical and political solution revolves. Most who choose to be politically left or right-wing are so because they want to protect life. And many then see the other wing sometimes just as a propaganda-influenced people who are either too stupid or too heartless and therefore on the side of those who want to destroy life. Many people often no longer understand the nature of the other perspective on reality. At the moment, society is increasingly splitting into two isolated perspectives on society, which is turning politics more and more into a kind of football match in which we are all transformed into English hooligans. This is problematic because it is not really a game, but such a division can have fatal consequences, in which we suddenly find ourselves in a new fascism, including mass murders, or in a centrally controlled brave new world order. Or it simply divides friends and families so that people no longer come together on holidays. This tribalistic game is simply breaking everything, destroying any pleasant discussion about political problems and, if it's not stopped, will cause total chaos, many deaths and a huge amount of suffering. The political visions move through universal and recurring patterns. They are archetypes. By archetypes, I mean something like a stereotype, but an archetype survives every flood. For example, the stereotype of a modern American will no longer exist when the Earth explodes, whatever you imagine the stereotype of a modern American to be. But the archetype of dislike and affection, or hate and love, are recurring principles that can be found in every organically and evolutionary growing species that becomes conscious. It is simply a natural advantage that guides behavior by seeking, protecting, and loving that which brings security and avoiding, fighting, and hating that which increases the risk of dying as an individual or group. Theoretically, other evaluations could exist, but through evolution, the manifestation of aversion to safety and love for the deadly is simply too unstable to prevail as a sustainable behavior. And if it does manifest itself in a group, then they simply disappear and create room for other life. I was going to talk about politics, but, well, the archetypes are a bit more universal than many people realize. So let's just start at the beginning. First, there was the birth of the universe. No, wait. Before that was mathematics and the possibility of how structures can manifest themselves. Let's take a tree, for example. Is a tree order or chaos? All trees look different, and yet they follow logical structures that allow us to identify them as trees. These are very simple patterns, which means that we can see the image of a tree in simple graphical representations if it follows the same structure. A tree follows the same laws, but manifests itself in different values. By values, I mean, for example, number of branches, length, or height. By laws, I mean how mathematical values are aligned in relation to each other. The best way to understand the synthesis of equal laws and variable values is to simply remove one of them from the tree. If all branches become the same length and get the same angles, the structure looks more like an antenna. Structures with repeating mathematical values can be found in fractal geometry or universal geometric shapes, such as triangles, squares, hexagons, etc. When we took the chaos out of the tree, we applied the equality of the law to the mathematical values. We can also do it the other way around. If we take the order out of the tree and apply the variability of the mathematical values to the laws, we only have unstructured chaos, which cannot be identified as a tree at all. Everything then behaves completely unpredictable. We also find unpredictability in quantum physics. Even in biology and the effects of individual biological life, it is not always possible to make clear predictions. A fish dies on land, but a cow dies underwater. So you cannot universally predict whether biological life will die when it is underwater. We have now created a formula on the side. Above, we have the essences of order and chaos. These are broken down into 4 elements, based on mathematical values and laws relating to equality and variability. From this, we can form 3 syntheses. The static synthesis is equal values that follows the same laws. The dynamic synthesis is variable values that cannot be predicted by universal laws. In the organic synthesis, where we find the structure of a tree, we also find mathematics with which we can better understand the laws of nature. Notice that the elements equal values and variable values are like natural opposites. Likewise, the elements equal laws and variable laws. One combination serves the realm of visible manifested values, the other serves the realm of invisible and passive laws. So again, first God created universal patterns, math, and something with universal archetypes. Then, somehow, however it happened, the universe was born. Or even many universes that can function according to completely different laws of nature. Somewhere between all these universes, where it is not too static that the same results are always calculated, and also not too chaotic that it simply calculates random events, is a universe that allows organic growth and development. And in such an organic reality, burning suns formed, and at some point solid planets and something with order out of chaos. Anyway, in places where the living conditions were not too cold and not too hot, and not too solid and not too volatile, organic life formed naturally through evolution and natural selection. This life can then organize itself in different ways. For example, collectively like bees and ants, or individualistic and unbound from the collective like snakes or other animals that are on their own from the beginning and do not cooperate except for mating. Then there's life in between. Eagles care for their children until they are old enough to survive on their own. Elephants, wolves or lions live in groups, but they are not as dependent on them as bees and can therefore go on their own individual ways of life. Collectivism and individualism are archetypes. In other words, recurring principles. However, these are not separate opposing poles, but two sides of a spectrum which, as a whole, forms a larger and multidimensional archetype. Like an additional dimension to space and time, but with a position in a non-physical dimension of recurring principles and possibilities, between order and chaos. In contrast to the other four dimensions, there is a clear beginning and an end. Every organically growing species always occupies a degree within this hermetically sealed spectrum. And only in the middle can a species emerge that is capable of developing political ideologies. Because if a species is too collectivist, an individual cannot break out of the group in order to have its own experiences. A swarmfish that leaves the swarm and breaks out of the herd behavior is easy prey and quickly sorted out. A species that is too individualistic is always dependent on solving problems independently, but it does not pass on any of this experience to its offspring. Any species that is capable of doing science and organizing society politically will inevitably be between individualism and collectivism. This means that it is natural for some individuals to lean more towards a collectivist nature and others towards the individualist nature due to natural deviation. This means that a conflict of visions is pre-programmed. Every species that grows evolutionary into consciousness will inevitably experience a dual conflict between a holistic and an individualistic view of society. In a different nature, people also think and evaluate things differently. If we were to make a bee and a snake so intelligent that they could talk to us, they would give us completely different answers when we ask them how to organize collectively and what moral and ethical duties they have towards a group. We have grown beyond the mental level of animals because we can think up ideologies, or rather discover them, or manifest in them, whatever. When we think and philosophize, we often do this in binary categories and their properties. But this can quickly become a problem, because the mental world is not binary and the spectrum of ideas can be better understood if we work with at least four elements. The problem is that collectivism and individualism can each be broken down into a life-friendly and a life-hostile element. This means that these archetypes can be presented inverted to each other as good and evil, if the pro-life element of one archetype is contrasted with the anti-life element of the other. Let's go back to the experiment with the two groups, and not form two categories of arbitrary words with an easily resolved misunderstanding, but from categories that are based on the archetypes and specifically aim to portray one side of the spectrum as evil and the other as good. We take altruism and egoism as two essences and add a few more terms. Now we take these and tell group A that altruism is good and egoism is evil. But it's not just about saying that it is, there's also a lot of thinking and philosophizing about it. Altruism is important. Without it, we could not maintain a stable society. We can't always just work against each other, but are much more efficient as a coordinated group. Violence and weapons should be rejected because they cause suffering. Egoism is a problem. Egoists are people who simply act ruthlessly and even without any scruples promote private business when they poison the land and let children work. Now we go to group B and say that altruism is evil and egoism is right. Egoism is important, and without it we would all just be willless and programmable robots. If no one wants to live for themselves, who can they live for? Who should everyone give presents to if everyone is too modest to accept gifts? Every life that exists always has the opportunity to live for itself, but it does not always have the opportunity to live for the group. Without self-preservation, every life will sooner or later be evolutionarily sorted out. Egoism is simply the defense of the self, self-authority and self-determination. It means not submitting to the group and its expectations. Altruism as morality is group pressure and the expectation that one will lay oneself on the sacrificial altar of ideologies and abandon one's own life for the delusions of the group. The problem with these two groups now is that both are half right. These are true elements of egoism and altruism, but they are compared one-sidedly. The pro-life element of one side is simply compared with the extreme and anti-life element of the other. This means that the conflict between the opposing definitions cannot be resolved as easy as with Gnarf and Plumbus. If you add to this the herd instinct with effects like in the Ash experiment, and the one-sided observation and isolation in a philosophical political bubble that sometimes lasts a lifetime, and no one even tries to understand the other, then conflicts between the two groups are unavoidable. These elements are part of a spectrum. Actually, they all belong together side by side, arranged from total altruism to total egoism. In the outer elements we find ideas that reject the nature of the other side. So altruism without thinking of oneself in the outer left element, and egoism without thinking of others in the outer right element. The inner right element is a natural antithesis of the outer left element, so self-protection versus self-destruction. The inner left element is a natural antithesis to the outer right element, so moral laws versus moral lawlessness. The political wings tend to fall more and more into two groups, blocking out the tendencies of their outer element but highlighting the extremes of the other. The left wing sees only the inner left and the outer right elements and builds an illusion that the right wing would be generally anti-life. The right wing only sees the elements outer left and inner right and builds up an illusion that the left wing would be generally anti-life. I've experienced that if I go to Team A now and say that egoism is missing, they say I'm an egoist. But I am not an egoist, I am the tree. And if I go to Team B and say that altruism is missing, then they say I am an altruist. But I am not an altruist, because I am the tree. No, I'm not really the tree. I'm standing next to the tree. Depending on the weather, I sometimes stand on the shade and sometimes on the sunny side. No, I don't really mean a tree. A tree offers simply the most suitable structure as a symbol to describe a universal organic principle that lies in the middle between static equality and dynamic freedom. Some say that they like the tree because of its chaos, because all trees are so diverse and different. Others say that they like the tree because of its order, because all trees follow a logical structure. Do you see the snake of sign under the tree? There's also another serpent. There are also two apples. The snake of sign offers a one-sided and false awakening to slowly turn the world into an inverted reflection of the metaphysics of nature. No matter what this snake says to you, never go too far from the center and the tree, for there's only lifeless desert. Let us now use the terms anti-authoritarian and authoritarian as essences from the spectrum in order to better understand the whole formula, the possibilities of representation and the opposing relationship of the four elements. I will classify authoritarian as right-wing and anti-authoritarian as left-wing. Some will now say that order is authoritarian and chaos is anti-authoritarian, just as mathematical laws restricts and dominates the variability of mathematical values. That is correct. This is because political visions move through four meta-levels, changing their relationship of order and chaos with each level. For example, a cold and self-centered egoistic mind leads to lawless morality, and that in turn leads to authoritarian actions. A warm, outward-looking altruistic mind tends towards moral laws and acts in a helpful and subordinate manner. But I don't want to make this too complicated here. So we have a spectrum of subordinate and superior and divide these into four elements. In the far left element, it is when one does not accept one's own will and puts oneself at the service of someone else. However, this can only happen if there's something or someone else to submit to. This can be found in the element on the far right. There, one does not only serve oneself, but also forces others to serve one's own will. In the inner left element is humility and the giving up of the self in order to avoid suffering in others and to honor their free will. In the inner right element is the defense of the self, not to subordinate oneself without a will, but to stand up for what one believes to be right. The more person A dominates person B, the more person B is subordinate. The more person A subordinates, the more person B dominates. Rule and duty are two sides of the same coin and cannot exist independently of each other. Sometimes the manifestation of rule and duty can be natural. For example, parents have at first their power over the child. which then slowly grows into a relationship in which the child is an adult and the same balance of power prevails, which then goes beyond this after some time, until the child begins to take power over the parents in order to help them in old age. I call these elements will to obey, will to humility, will to self, and will to rule. I will use these as more general terms that can also be applied to ideologies. These names of the elements are like earth, water, air, and fire, except that they are specific elements for morality, while the alchemical elements are more universal and include both physical and mental concepts. In the spectrum and the essences of subordinate and superior, we not only find the relationship between individuals to each other, or between the population and the state, but also the idea of authoritarian and anti-authoritarian ideologies, which in the end are actually also what we find under left and right. In the anti-authoritarian ideology, people are viewed more from a caring and feminine perspective. They want to help the poor and the weak and see humanity as one big family. This perspective is not wrong, but it becomes problematic when it moves to the far left, as it then tries to overcome economic and national inequality through central planning and globalization to ensure that people have equal prosperity. In the authoritarian ideology, people are viewed from an educational and masculine perspective. It is known that suffering is important in order to grow, and that certain cultural rules are necessary so that everything doesn't break down into adultery and broken families. We need challenge and competition, because without it we simply degenerate mentally and have nothing to grow from. Inequalities are a natural result of competition and a good motivation for people to perform at their best, from which everyone else can later benefit. In extreme cases, authoritarian ideology behaves like breed and breeder, where people should be sorted out, sterilized and bred like animals. It assumes a lawless morality in which only evolution and the right of the strongest exist, and the political system should therefore be geared towards breeding people and rejecting and violating the idea of universal human rights. It doesn't matter if people move from the middle towards the anti-authoritarian or the authoritarian ideology. The political system and the state become more and more authoritarian and totalitarian the more they move away from the center. As I said, terms are often interpreted completely differently on both sides, which can lead to problems in communication between the left and the right perspectives. I have noticed that many on the left tend to understand the term anti-authoritarian as an anti-authoritarian system and associate it with the inner left element. From the authoritarian perspective, the term is often associated with the idea that we should subordinate ourselves like bees to a communist system. Also, the terms freedom and individualism are more associated in the right wing with the libertarian and individualistic system, where freedom is protected from state control, while in the left wing it can be understood more as freedom to exploit and oppress. Terms can cause great confusion when they are associated with different meanings, because both are somehow right about the meanings they associate with the terms. Freedom or equality, authoritarian or anti-authoritarian. Capitalism or socialism, egoism or altruism, alone or together, national and related to one's own culture or international and related to humanity, collectivism or individualism, universalism or arbitrariness, feminine or masculine, and so on. The idea here is to use a formula with which we can overcome the binary view of the mental world and such concepts. The opposite of the essence of order is chaos, the opposite of water is fire, and the opposite of earth is air. Order occupies the two left elements, chaos the two right elements. The life-friendly organic order is found in the synthesis of the two inner elements. The opposite of the organic order is the constructed order, as a synthesis of the two outer elements. It is basically a reversal of nature, and in that something has not grown out of itself, but is constructed. Which is not a problem in the case of a constructed house or other objects. But when life falls under the condition of being constructed, it also loses the natural mental properties of the free mind, and consciousness slowly decays, as it is no longer necessary. Life would grow into a kind of computer, evolutionarily evolved to perform tasks unconsciously. In the constructed and artificial synthesis is the synthesis of the artist and his art, or a house builder and the house, or a totalitarian state and the population. This representation as a circle or square is therefore very similar to the political compass. Let's go back to morality, assumptions about nature and the understandings of freedom and equality. The whole thing should really be viewed as neutrally as possible. It is simply a nature of ways in which morality can manifest itself in consciousness. I do draw the inner elements as green and the outer as red and have a bias, but I also think that these are simply the elements that we need to orient ourselves to as a species, because otherwise we simply won't evolve spiritually. Everything has two sides, and so does freedom. There's positive freedom to something and negative freedom from something. All four elements serve different concepts of positive and negative freedom. The outer right element is a total self-reference and total independence from the collective. The total positive freedom to do anything is also the total negative freedom from all laws. The inner right element serves the positive freedom to self-authority, which is then the negative freedom from command and state control. In the inner left element is the positive freedom to demand help, which is then the negative freedom from need and suffering. In the outer left element is the equality of positive freedom to everything. So in this element, it is declared wrong if another individual has more possibilities than others. While in lower levels of consciousness we would find the bees there, in the human level of consciousness we would find political ideologies such as Authoritarian Socialism, which aims to achieve financial equality of outcome, or to ensure through central planning that the homes of all citizens have the same size, which then results in very static and monotonic living spaces. In the far right element we would find reactionary fascism or other ideologies that justify their actions on the basis of moral lawlessness. Even if the idea of equality and freedom first split into two opposing poles, they become similar again in their extremes and serve the external elements, but from different directions. Both extremes then make use of a moral lawlessness to ensure that a condition they declare to be true applies equally everywhere. The synthesis of the external elements is a constructed morality, because centrally controlled violence is used to create conditions that are not given by nature. The amount of violence required is equal to the falseness of an ideology. The more centralized violence is needed to achieve ideological conditions, the more it contradicts what is naturally right. The inner synthesis is very similar to the social market economy. This brings us to economics. There we find two primary terms: capitalism and socialism. I have noticed that many people understand them differently, but some terms are clearer. For example, when it comes to essences such as collectivism and individualism, equality and freedom, solidarity and competition, altruism and egoism, these can at least be assigned to economic ideologies that both sides would agree on in most cases. However, when it comes to what exactly is meant by these terms, opinions are divided. The outer right element is a rejection of public property and universal rights, which can lead to people being forced to perform undignified acts against their will due to emergency situations. Whether someone tells you that they will kill you if you don't do something, or whether they don't give someone water and let them die of thirst, it doesn't really matter. The inner left element and the rights to get help when one is in need or in danger can prevent the exploitation of emergency situations. However, these can be made possible in completely different ways. Freedom from need can be achieved through a national tax system, voluntary projects, or through regional self-sufficiency and cooperation. The outer left element is a rejection of private law. There we find the idea of a socialist planned economy. The inner right element is the idea of the free market, and the inner left element is a state intervention to protect workers, nature, or people in need, or even a voluntary community. After all, people do not all have to live a Western capitalist lifestyle, but communities can also be formed that organize and provide for themselves, also with more modern technology. In these elements, we also see again how the terms can be defined and understood in opposite poles. However, it is not just about definitions, but about opposing perspectives on life. They both look at the tree and want to stay close to nature, but one stands to the left of the tree towards order and the other to the right of the tree towards chaos. The left tends to see a conspiracy in economy, the right in the state. That's why the right often talks about the deep state and the left about capitalism. Both can be played off against each other because the deep state is a cooperation between business and the state. On the left, you are seen as a conspiracy theorist if you say the deep state is a problem. On the right, you are seen as an authoritarian socialist if you say capitalism is a problem. Instead of public property and state regulations versus private property and unregulated markets, we should look at the idea of polypoles versus monopoly. There is not only the state as a possible monopoly that can turn into an all-controlling organization, but also private business. It actually does not matter who owns the all-controlling monopoly for everything. The problem would be its existence itself. Here it is not so easy where to place the Nazis, as they serve both external elements. However, their morality and view of life comes from the right-wing vision of competition and egoism. The left seeks the answer to the question if National Socialism was socialism, rather in the reason and values. Socialism strives for equality of rights and equality of collective property. But National Socialism is not interested in the equality of rights and equal property for all. From this perspective, it is very clear that National Socialism is definitely not socialism. The right is looking for the answer to the question in the process and the economy, so state intervention or the avoidance of the state through a free market economy. Socialism there is therefore a term that does not stand for equality, but for all-controlling state. As far as that goes, National Socialism was socialism because it was an all-controlling state. When the left and the right argue about this, they are often talking around each other. They use the same terms but hear different meanings. So when the words and symbols are said, "Is National Socialism a form of socialism?" then one side perceives the meaning, "Are morally lawless people for human rights?" and the others perceive the meaning, "Are fascist authoritarian states authoritarian states?" Sadly, most people don't realize that they are only looking at the same thing from different directions, and then start fighting. And the more one fights, the angrier one gets, and the longer one does it, the more difficult it is to listen to the other person at all. But everyone makes a few funny memes in their bubble that take a one-dimensional view of politics in primitive messages. At some point, they all beat themselves up and want to kill each other, with weapons, which brings us to the concepts of gun rights. In the far-right element is the will to rule and the total arsenal of weapons to enforce this power. But weapons are not generally a bad thing. You can also carry weapons to protect yourself from attackers. Anyone who wants to get power over a land wants to take away the weapons of everyone they want to oppress, so that they are forced to serve. In the far left element is the disarmament and the ban of being able to defend oneself against violence. The total disarmament of all citizens would also require the total use of weapons by a monopoly on violence. The two outer elements thus again serve the synthesis in which we find totalitarian systems or slavery. The inner left element is what avoids the outer right element. This means that there are certain restrictions and bans on weapons, but the righteous and non-criminal citizen is allowed to own weapons for self-defense. Again, left and right often see only their inner element and the outer element of the other side. A good balance between righteous citizens with weapons and the state as a monopoly on violence would ensure that law and order are enforced, but that the country is not simply taken over by an enemy, but that the citizens can defend their homes themselves. There's then no central anchor point for the total takeover of a country. If every citizen could own and build weapons of mass destruction, or if the state alone would have the right to weapons, hostile conditions would arise. Authoritarian systems censor their critics. Freedom of speech is the foundation of a free world. Here too we can apply the ideas of the elements. First, we have restricted and unrestricted in the two essences. In the inner right element and the will to self is the freedom of speech, to be able to criticize politics and everything without someone coming and forbidding it. The opposite of this is the outer left element, in which there is no freedom of speech, and one is forced to obey. But it's not that simple, because freedom of speech absolutism would mean that threats and insults would not be punished, which would mean that many people would not dare to speak out. So you can also prevent people from expressing themselves critically by exerting collective pressure on them. The right tends to see the negative freedom of speech as not being restricted. The left sees the positive freedom of speech, that minorities are also heard in the masses, which then give rise to ideas such as the promotion of minorities. Both of which, as I said, have two sides. An authoritarian system is in a position to lie, to steer people up against each other, and to spread as much propaganda as it wants, in order to control the citizens whose right to speak has been taken away. Progressive and conservative are also two interesting terms that are associated with political visions. If we orient towards order and chaos, or negative and positive, we would of course classify conservation and looking to the past as order and change and looking to the future as chaos. As I said, this is due to the 4 meta-levels. But here it is primarily about the political visions, which serve both order and chaos depending on the level. The term progressive and conservative can also be understood very differently. What I understand most by the term conservative here is the inner right element, which either tries to come together in a liberal synthesis with the inner left element or joins forces with the outer right element. Since even if the liberal right and the far right have different ideas about how politics, the state and society should be organized, they are of the same opinion when they criticize the left wing and especially the outer left element. Conservatives see themselves strengthened in the assumption that the Nazis were left-wing, as we classify conservative as right-wing and the striving for change as left-wing. Nazis were not conservative, but they were not progressive either. National Socialism was about trying to restore the genetic and ethnic conditions of the past. So it is not just looking at what worked well in the last or second last generation in order to hold on to such values, but constructing a new future on the basis of a time long past, and then being prepared to do anything without moral laws to achieve this state. The reactionary element of recreation is something that is produced in the right-wing perspective on life. Progressives are more open to new things, and conservatives like things to stay the way they are. And that's perfectly fine. I'm sometimes one and sometimes the other, actually. It just depends on my mood, whether I'm in the mood to try something new or whether I'm sticking with what I already have. The concepts of progressive and conservative can also be applied very well to migration. Those who are conservative are also critical of other value systems, and therefore also critical of immigration if it changes the local culture. Those who are progressive and open to new things are more likely to be critical of their own culture, if it reacts too prejudiced and dismissively to change or to people from other cultures. If cultural identities are turned into an ideology, then this also manifests itself again in a strong state. The more the state promotes its own culture, the more destructive it becomes for cultural minorities. The more the state promotes the foreign, the more destructive it becomes for the national culture. In the inner right element, there's a protection and valuing of one's own culture and criticism of cultures when they change it. In the inner left element is the protection of cultural minorities and tolerance of foreign cultures. In the outer left element is the rejection of one's own culture and the sacrifice for others. There it is a policy that goes beyond helping people seeking protection, but attempts to settle people with different cultural value system permanently, on a large scale and through state violence. In the outer right element, there's a reactionism to far left actionism. The more the far left element has intervened in culture, the more likely and fatal the rise of xenophobic ideologies that want to restore old conditions. The left wing primarily sees the elements of openness to the world and xenophobia, The right wing primarily sees the elements of protecting one's own culture and hostility towards the population. People on the right are quick to speak of traitors to the people, while the left wing tends to use terms such as racists. A big problem at the moment is that humans are somewhere in between the unconscious and conscious. Man has already recognized science in physical things, but is not fully aware of the nature of mental science. Metaphysics, the science of mind or the science of nature of universal moral laws, does not exist as a collectively recognized knowledge. We often talk about universality and equality, but we cannot really say why. Why universal rights? Why do morals and ideologies exist at all? I don't think that anyone who doesn't understand the evolution of the mind would be able to understand why morality exists and why it is not any different. Why don't we just feel it's right to drown our children in the lake instead of protecting them? Beyond evolution, such ideas are neutral. Through evolution, however, the murder of one's children becomes an immorality that sorts out any family, culture, or species that does it. That's why we find it immoral in the first place. Because everyone was filtered out who thought it was good, and everyone had advantages who thought it was immoral. Since the nature of morality is not understood in a coldly rational way, problems arise in society as the right wing begins to apply biological principles to morality. Freedom, variability, independence, and competition are applied to the idea of universal rights. This then leads to assumptions that the right of the strongest is a real tragic truth of morality, which can then become very misanthropic ideologies. In the left perspective, it becomes problematic because the nature of universal rights is subconsciously perceived, but not understood from a cold and mathematical view. This leads one to not only look for universality, connectedness, and equality in moral laws, but to apply these principles to the physical world. In the same but inverted way, the elements on the far right apply the concepts of biology to the mental, the far left tries to apply the concepts of the mind to the biological material world. We also find the concepts of mental and biological genders in the formula. Mental genders are the feminine and masculine principles found in Hermetic alchemy. This is not the same as the genders in biology. These mental genders merge fluid into one another, and nature itself synthesizes them into a unity in the middle. Since all conscious life that strays too far away from this synthesis and begins to reject one of the mental genders decays. We find these mental genders not only in concepts such as rational and analytical mind or empathic and warm-hearted mind, but also in political ideologies. The left wing serves the feminine principle and the right wing the masculine. However, this does not mean that women become men if they have a cold and rational mind, or are politically right-wing. Nor does it mean that a coldly rational or politically right-wing woman need gender surgery. So mental gender doesn't really have anything to do with biology. Both outer elements have in common that they declare it wrong if the mental gender does not correspond to the biological gender. When the outer right element begins to transfer the concepts of biology to the mental genders, this happens through the assumption that, for example, women must always be in the feminine caring mother role because otherwise they would not be a real woman. Or that men always have to be strong fighters and providers, because otherwise they wouldn't be a real man. They are then forced to do so by cultural pressure or, in case of authoritarian right-wing states, are even obligated to take on feminine or masculine roles. When the far left element applies the concepts of mental gender to biology, it does so by believing that, for example, a biological healthy woman who has a masculine mind should actually be a man by nature. Medical interventions are then used in an attempt to adapt the biological gender to the mental gender. However, this does not mean that there cannot also be biological mutations that results in the presence of either both sex organs or none at all, which justifies the idea of a third option for gender identification such as man, woman, and diverse. Okay, let's work our way through everything again and summarize all the concepts into a larger diagram. These are abstract summaries of many ideas and tendencies on several topics. So this should not be viewed statically and someone can favor completely different ideas in individual political positions. One can be on the left on some topics and on the right on others. The political visions are based on an assumption about nature. These assumptions can synthesize, but they can also divide. The right liberal element is a thesis, the left liberal element is an antithesis. The far left element is a rejection and split from the thesis. The far right element is a rejection and a split from the antithesis. Thesis and antithesis are also a bit like theism and anti-theism. The right wing is usually more oriented towards religion and its rules, while the left wing tends towards atheism and believes that we can plan a fairer world through the state. Let's start with the thesis. This is a right liberal view of nature. This assumes that nature lies in chaos. What is right is what prevails in evolutionary terms. What does the wolf care about the right of the rabbit? A right-wing perspective looks primarily at the exoteric, material and biological world and its principles. But the right-wing's assumption that nature is in the right of the strongest is only in the far-right element, and not the actual nature of the political right-wing perspective on society. The true nature of the right-wing is the freedom from the state. It is assumed that no state exists and plans by nature, and yet things are held together and people and life can come into existence even without the state. This means that they believe in a law that stands above the positive law of the state. This also explains the right-wing tendency towards religion and theism. If there is no state to hold society together, then it is cultural values and the rules that go with them. Which is why most right-wingers are open to the state if it serves the security and protects culture and the people from being changed from above. An important concept in a society without a state is the traditional family, so that people have social security and care for people in old age or in the event of illness, which is why this is an essential value of right-wing virtues. This is why gay marriage is also viewed critically, as the idea of marriage is not primarily based on sexual attraction or love, but on security for children and a lifelong commitment to care for each other. Since homosexuals cannot have children, there is no point in what marriage is about for the right-wing perspective. Now we come to the antithesis. This is a left liberal view of nature. It assumes that the nature of morality lies in order. Humanity is seen as one big family and the aim is to avoid suffering in others. The left-wing perspective does not primarily look at the exoteric and material world of biology, but at the esoteric mental world in which we find alchemy, with which the nature of mental and moral possibilities can be understood. There, concepts of equality and interconnectedness apply. Instead of a Darwinian morality, they assume universality in law and morality. To achieve this, they are willing to make use of the state. Instead of a free market, there's intervention, regulation and redistribution in order to support and help workers, minorities, the old or people in emergency situations. Tolerance towards homosexuals can also be found there, as they do not harm anyone and can also provide themselves with social security. Even if a homosexual couple cannot have children, they can still adopt one. The question of adoption should be based less on sexual orientation and more on whether someone can provide a safe home for children in the long term and is psychologically suitable. Marriage is just a promise tied to a ritual. To forbid someone to make such a promise would be an unnecessary aggression. My philosophy, by the way, is about using evolutionary theory, like a bad social Darwinist, to describe a universal human right that places human dignity and free will as a central anchor point around which the search for political solutions should revolve. I have noticed that if I go to the right with this idea, then I am one of the utopian left with the idea of a universal human right. And if I go to the left with it, then I'm one of the evil social Darwinist Nazis because of the use of the theory of evolution in relation to law and morality. But I'm not an utopian leftist or social Darwinist Nazi, I'm just a tree. When the antithesis rejects the thesis, it begins to synthesize with the outer element on the left. Behind the elements are not just abstract concepts and ideas, but possibilities of how consciousness can manifest itself and make judgments. And so the holistic view in the outer left element becomes the assumption that inequality by nature is always a sign of an ideology. This means that all mechanisms that produce unequal results and unequal treatment are perceived as false. This then leads to concepts such as a traditional family becoming to be viewed as false because the child has more positive legal rights than other children. Or that all people from outside the country should have the same legal rights as the citizens of the country. For example, when it comes to voting rights or the welfare state. If the left wing moves to the outer element, it starts to love the whole world and wants to do everything it can do to eliminate all the suffering in the world, even if it leads to total self-destruction. It is difficult to criticize individuals when they are in the outer left element, because they are in a duality of virtuous altruism and narcissistic egoism. In this duality, if you are against their ideas of helping people in need, then you are quickly seen as someone who wants people in need to die. This is based on a very emotional assumption about human nature, but that doesn't mean that the emotional view is wrong. If the emotional and empathic is rejected, one synthesizes with the outer right psychopathic element. There we find fascist reactionary Nazi ideologies with horrible experiments on human beings. The patterns apply on the large and the small scale. Not only in terms of ideologies, but also as an individual, one can behave psychopathically and heartlessly towards people with different origins, different opinions, or people who use a space key instead of tabs when programming. In the case of total division among programmers, this can quickly lead to the tabs and spacebar groups no longer perceiving themselves as real people who have their own needs and their own individual view of life. Individuals whose nature leans towards the space key individuals whose nature leans towards the conservative usually don't want totalitarian states and strong leaders. But once they are threatened by an authoritarian imperialist left-wing element gaining more and more control over society and building an ever stronger state, some start cheering for strong right-wing leaders to be given the power to reshape and transform an entire system and society. If this gets out of control, it can become a very dangerous political movement. The enemy of what liberal conservatives want is also in their own political vision, and they can move there without realizing it. This is how a kind of religious leader and savior cult develops in the right wing. The person who is then given full political power is then seen by some as a God-sent liberator, which is really a quite naive and dangerous basis for giving a stranger with whom one actually has no personal connection the power to rebuild an entire country. Such religious cults that turn a political leader into a biblical figure can be found not only in Hitler but also in Trump. But I'm not saying that it's the same thing. I would see the American political idea behind Trump primarily as the right liberal element and the political idea behind Hitler as the far right element. Still, the movement around Trump seems very problematic to me, as it tends to one-sidedly serve the right wing and thus reinforces the division between left and right perspectives. There's simply too much personality cult and provocation to convince anyone who has a left-wing perspective on society. The more hateful, angry and divided people are, the more open they are to strong states or leaders. The more people are kind and help each other, the less the state is needed. We also have experienced a strong division in society when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic. I myself only realized quite late that it was never about the question of vaccinating or not vaccinating. It was about getting everyone to think the other person would be stupid, wrong, naive and dangerous because of their natural deviation in perception. By nature, some are open and others skeptical. It was about destroying families and friendships, because if families and friends don't provide themselves with social security, then in most cases the state has to do it. It doesn't matter whether you wanted to be vaccinated or not. It was just about that both sides are increasingly rejecting the other. People were turning towards politicians they don't know and away from family members they love. Everyone was so convinced of themselves, while we were all just given information for which we had no definite proof of truth. Just to send each other studies, blog posts or statements from people to say, "See, the meaning behind this sequence of symbols and letters proves that I am right." And the other one says, Haha, no, look at this sequence of symbol that others have made that proves that I am right. And in the end, it was just a sequence of symbols. Just a bunch of one-eyed people who have said things on television and on the internet full of self-confidence. Anything can be expressed in words, but that doesn't mean it's true. But people just believed those who presented them with a series of symbols and letters that fit their own worldview, which is based on a subconscious assumption of nature that arises from their mental basis and life experiences. For the middle, I use terms such as liberal or libertarian in my diagrams. Nowadays, the term libertarian is associated with the idea of anarchist capitalism and the total privatization of all things. But that is not what I mean by libertarian synthesis. I mean the abstract idea of the synthesis of right and left libertarian elements. I do not want to establish an ideology with my analysis. I do not want to say how the world should be, but rather describe the logical framework of possibilities of how the world could be. Ways of life can vary from individual to individual or culture to culture. Whether one prefers to stand in the shade of the tree or on the sunny side is in many cases just a question of taste or results from the local living conditions. What I want is for conditions to finally be restored in which pleasant political discussions can take place and solutions can be found. And I would like people to develop an immunity to political propaganda that is specifically aimed at dividing the population in the center between left and right into two groups, because both become more and more open to totalitarian control if they are promised to overcome the other wing and its worldview. I would also like to point out that the problem with different meanings can also be applied to the term Marxism, which in my choice of term I associate with the anti-life extreme of the political left vision and which I reject. However, some people do not understand Marxist criticism of capitalism to mean overcoming the private property and the free market, but rather the idea of a dialectic to unite opposing poles, which in the case of economics would be a social market economy that stands somewhere between unregulated freedom and total control. So a kind of philosophical idea of thesis plus antithesis equals synthesis, which is pretty much exactly what I'm trying and striving for. Am I actually a Marxist now, or am I anti-Marxist? I have no idea. That depends entirely on what meaning you associate with the term or symbol Marxism. I am definitely not an absolutist, but I personally think that the best solution would be a democracy in which the masses understand the nature and evolution of the mind and morality, and thus also the perspective of their archetypal opposition. Which solutions are then found depends entirely on the situation, the individual living conditions, and the individual tastes of the people. The spectrum between order and chaos is a view of Eden from the side. But we can also look at Eden from above to realize that one can move away from the tree in the middle in many directions. One problem with the spectrum between order and chaos is that the ideology of total privatization is lost as a political extreme. That's why I have another representation in which we work with three axes. One axis from total privatization to total collectivization, then an axis of total equality of prosperity to total inequality, then an axis from total national and cultural property to no cultural and national property. One axis from capitalism to anti-capitalism, one from Marxism to anti-Marxism, and one axis from fascism to anti-fascism. We can combine these axes into a larger structure. Marxism and capitalism have in common that they are anti-fascist. Capitalism and fascism have in common that they are anti-Marxist. Fascism and Marxism have in common that they are anti-capitalist. This means that when capitalists and Marxists talk about fascism, they agree and reject it. The same is true when fascists and capitalists talk about Marxism, or when Marxists and fascists talk about capitalism. It is often the case that people start cooperating when they have the same enemy. So we see in the current political developments that libertarian capitalists, conservatives and far-right all agree that the political system is too woke, too left, too Marxist or too socialist, whatever term is used to describe the political idea that has one-sidedly aligned itself to the left and rejects the idea of the right. The same can be seen in the left spectrum when anarchists and communists fight together under the flag of anti-fascism against fascism and capitalist exploitation. After the revolution, however, anarchists and communists are no longer friends. Likewise, conservative liberal and authoritarian nationalists. But before the revolution, they like to meet for coffee and talk about how stupid the current system is. In the elements and syntheses, we find not only individual possibilities of how consciousness can look at the world, society and itself, or the basic mathematical and structural composition of all possible realities, but also the individual living conditions under which morals and ideologies arise. However, morals and ideologies also change the conditions of life, which can create a cycle. Life begins under the free living condition. There's nothing that intervenes from outside and creates security, and so it becomes a natural advantage to develop empathy in order to cooperate intuitively with others. Concepts such as a classical family and traditions emerge as they ensure survival. Through cooperation and prosperity, hardship in society is eliminated and the state emerges as it is a helpful construct for a stable society. As people no longer have to act out of necessity, more and more people are concerned with self-fulfillment as they have to work less and have more time. The new living condition makes the world fairer and revolutions arise that rebel against old traditions and cultural values, as they are no longer necessary under the new living conditions. However, since life is not aware of how morals and ideologies emerge, it begins to go beyond the fair world to move from the free living conditions towards equal and static living conditions. With each generation that grows up under the state intervention feels more natural. The traditional family is replaced by social programs and there is no longer any reason for social cooperation. Beyond evolution, it is subjective to feel whether we should live like ants or like snakes. Individuals of a collectivist nature are increasingly evolving to view the nature of the species in the one-sided we and in collectivism. Individuals of an individualistic nature evolve more and more towards an assumption of unregulated Darwinian competition. Right-wing extremist groups are on the rise, who see in developments only a delusion of self-sacrifice that is not compatible with evolution in the long term, and are beginning to turn to ideas that describe universality in law as a delusion that is based only on emotions but cannot be justified rationally. The state begins to invert the condition of life that produced pro-life morality and friendly states of mind. Even if society didn't split into a feminine and masculine axis because of its two-sided nature, isolating themselves from each other and becoming more and more toxic until they punch each other in the face and leave only rubble, society would also collapse if it turned into a purely static construct by overcoming competition and cultural value systems and focusing only on equal outcomes. No change can take place under the static principle, and so it veers out until it collapses, leaving only rubble in its path. The society that was once organized like a forest with many trees, all going through a small cycle of birth, growth, flowering, aging and death, is then merged into one big artificial tree. In nature, trees exist independently of each other and grow side by side. This allows them to constantly try out new things, and they are in a constant process of realigning themselves with the environment, while also realigning the environment in return. But if all forests' organic processes are centrally controlled, the whole forest becomes a kind of entity that itself, like all life, goes through a process of growth, aging and death. Sooner or later the system collapses, and everything that was too dependent on it dies with it. When the heart dies, the brain dies too. When the brain dies, the heart dies too. That's right for us as individuals. But if it were the case when someone dies, a chain reaction is triggered and everyone dies, then it would be problematic. If an authoritarian system collapses and there's no more food or resources to be found, then everyone in the country is in a bad situation. One can only hope that their state was a small one and didn't take over an entire continent, because then they can simply move to nearby countries. Either way, sooner or later the system collapses the more it centralizes and moves away from the inner alchemical elements. Either because it wears out and breaks, or because of a reactionary fascism rises, triggering total chaos and the total collapse of society. A bloody war between radicalized and divided feminine and masculine principles. Everyone loses, death, silence, rebirth. From the ruins of society, the condition of having to cooperate with one another and provide for the family emerges again. These values once again eliminate hardship and suffering in society. The circle is closed, everything back to the beginning. This cycle happens in every species that develops evolutionary into consciousness and is somewhere between consciousness and unconsciousness. We subconsciously run in circles, just as we look at these ants that are doomed by a mechanism to run in circles until they are extinct, and just as we think we are clever to see how they could just get out and survive, so a conscious species would look at humans running subconsciously through a cycle that cannot be seen physically because it takes place in the world of archetypes and their eternal relationships with each other. I think that this cycle is so universal that there is a great filter in it that dooms every species to go through a moral and cultural cycle of rise, aging, decay, death and rebirth until time runs out or the cycle is broken. As a species evolves from the unconscious to consciousness, it will inevitably recognize the science of physical systems and be able to plan society politically before it recognizes the science of metaphysical systems. The world of archetypal patterns functions through higher abstractions of being that are not as easy to recognize as physical things. The mind must be more advanced than a mind needs to be to do physical science and politics. Whenever the communist dinosaurs reshape everything into a utopian one-world society, a big angry asteroid comes afterward to bring the apocalypse. The shift into the one-sidedness of the sign creates a one-sided shift in society into the sign on the other side. When a species moves through the cycle, a metaphysical split occurs between the two hermetic genders. This split takes place on a large and a small scale. The living conditions in which society exists are becoming increasingly constructed and a synthesis of variable laws in order to artificially impose conditions. Under these conditions, the relationship between the citizens and the state is in a situation where citizens lose their right to self and must serve, while the state is transformed from an authority through competence to an authority through oppression, which can only maintain its power by fighting all those who question it. Government power is also related to how divided people are in the ideological world. At the end of the cycle with total division, there's only one toxic feminine wing that laughs and wants to save the whole world, forcing it into a kind of collective messiah self-sacrifice complex. The masculine wing becomes furious because it has no desire to sacrifice itself for the collective good, and wants to burn everything down while making totally vicious and hateful statements. This division then also takes place in the minds of individuals. Everyone becomes naive to their own vision and arrogant to the opposition, toxic feminine to their own side and toxic masculine to their political opposition. I was wondering whether I should end the video now, but since we are here now, we might as well go on the next level of consciousness. I believe that this is very important and shows what a great danger we are living in, that a new anti-human social Darwinist occult Nazi ideology could rise up again, which could lead to incredibly evil conditions in the face of technological progress. The third level is primarily about recognizing the mental and archetypal patterns, and taking a look at nature which is explored through metaphysics. Metaphysics can be misunderstood, which is why we have to take a look at another diagram first. If we use a formula to analyze the concepts of exoterics, so physics and the material, and esoterics, meaning metaphysics and the mental, the correct metaphysics can be found in the inner left element. This is where we find the science that is seen in this video. There we find Plato, Carl Gustav Jung, or Isaac Newton when it comes to his alchemical work. In the inner right element is the science of the physical. This is where we find Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, or Isaac Newton when it comes to his work on physics. The other two elements mix physical and metaphysical concepts in the wrong way. On the left, a kind of esoteric, astrological, one-world New Age ideology in which we all become vegetarians with light food and in which we all have the great enlightenment that we are all one and connected. That the we would be the truth and the I, the ego, that would be the lie. Oneness. And because we are all one, we are also one big world nation. Because only when we are all under the same positive right of the state and everything we have is shared fairly is everything morally right. The enlightenment that everything is one-sided. If we go to the level of the highest categories and abstractions, in which we unite everything under one formula, we find a spectrum between wholeness and detail. The highest unity does not just mean the summary of all things, but the summary of a spectrum between the total summary of all things into a unity and the total differentiation into an infinite number of individually separated categories. The Nazi occultism of far-right esoterics is in a completely different class to these overly friendly hippies of the outer left element. That's where it gets really nasty. Let's come back to the third level of consciousness, where ideologies exist that most people don't even know can exist because they lack knowledge of the mind. Let's summarize all of this again. At the center of mathematical and structural possibilities, we find a universe in which organic life can emerge. This life can then organize itself in a multitude of possibilities, which is somewhere between collectivism like bees and individualism like reptiles. Only within these essences can life ascend into the next level, where the human being is. There the species begins to develop moral ideas which are really just different degrees of a spectrum of how consciousness might manifest. This is where the cycle takes place, and the species is repeatedly denied to ascend to the next level. However, a new attempt is usually given again and again, and a new society emerges from the ashes of the previous war. But even if the species does not ascend to the third level, there are always individuals who recognize concepts of it and understand the metaphysical structures. These can then also serve different elements, which brings us to esoteric concepts and ideas such as the path of the left and the right hand. The path of the left hand can be found here on the right and the path of the right hand on the left. This again has to do with the 4 meta-levels. The term superhuman or Übermensch level of consciousness may also trigger direct associations with Nazi ideology in some people. I would like to distance myself very clearly from this. What my metaphysics is about is an opposite to Nazi occultism. It's like comparing water with fire. Here it is about using a human-friendly metaphysics and the theory of evolution to refute the misanthropic and social Darwinist esotericism of the Nazis and expose it as an unnatural and malicious construct. Superhuman is simply meant to be beyond and above the level of humanity's perception. In the same way, the metaphysics here is also a supernatural philosophy and formula, as it allows to describe the sum of all realities that go beyond our nature and its laws. By the way, I don't want to sound like I have got it all figured out and am now high up on the next level of consciousness. The discovery of my theory of everything and the step into the realm of the dead and eternally resting archetypes was related to a lot of madness, and can rather be explained by a trinity of mental disorders that stood on the destructive anti-pillars of mental and intellectual support. At some point I want to psychoanalyze my mind and my madness with a formula in a video. It was all totally schizo, really. A total bipolar madness that was as if my mind had split into several perspectives on reality. Then I had to wander through the spiritual world to find all the individual parts into which my mind had split, and then to reunite them. I recorded the map and tried to understand how consciousness manifests itself in different places within this map. Some things were not easy for me, and even today I sometimes have the feeling that the human mind is not really made for looking back so deeply into itself. I just wanted to mention again that just because I have entered the third level, it does not mean that I am not just an idiot who is constantly wrong and who forms one-sided and one-eyed opinions that I only recognize much later, or even not at all. And then obviously I really was a bit of a schizo, which underlines once again that it is best not to believe anything I say, because it could just be my delusions. If it can't be recognized and understood by others, then it also means that my statement would be wrong anyway, because it is about eternal and recurring concepts. It is about orders that do not need a source, as they stand on their own. An order behind the sum of all hypothetical possibilities that everyone has to recognize for themselves. I can only point there, but you have to go there yourself, because it is a path inwards. In the element on the far left, we find a conscious will to obey or serve and to sacrifice oneself. This is not the same as in a political ideology where one wants to force the collective to do so, or as in a Jonestown mass suicide, but it is about counteracting ideologies and authoritarian states. We can take the example of the burning monk, which showed that no matter how much power and force one would use, all the resources one spends to control these monks would not pay off. This is white magic extremism and a strong symbolic image of anarchist protest. However, I must also make it clear that no one should have the idea of imitating this, because otherwise one would just be one of the many lunatics who set themselves on fire somewhere, and at best show how mentally unstable someone and their people are. Anyone who thinks they need to do something like that needs to see a doctor immediately because they would be a danger to themselves and others. So the right-hand path is about sacrificing oneself in order to protect and defend others from authoritarian violence and control. This is something morally righteous, and so we rightly honor people who have sacrificed themselves in the event of the rise of an authoritarian system and have fallen in war. The outer left element in the conscious level therefore only wants to keep life in the inner elements, and is no longer needed when the species has made the leap to the conscious level and can no longer be influenced by mind control techniques from the outer right element. The inner synthesis contains the knowledge of natural law as a universal human right and the desire to avoid suffering in others. This is where universality is correctly applied to the world of moral laws. It includes the will to self and also the knowledge that suffering is important in order to grow and that life is not an utopia in which we are always cared for and mothered from above, as if we were children incapable of being independent. Suffering can be like an invitation to a world beyond the physical, where one begins to look at one's own mind from the outside. Suffering is often in the same proportion as mental progress, and without it there would only be stagnation. In the element on the far right, we find a psychopathic view of mental teachings that is detached from empathy. The arbitrariness of values is falsely applied to the concepts of law and morality in order to produce the law of the strongest and the belief that there would only be the will to rule and evolution. The avoidance of suffering is rejected in order to one-sidedly serve mental advancement. This worldview is created under certain living conditions, and we are increasingly moving towards to such conditions. It doesn't matter what is morally true. When the right wing takes over and it doesn't synthesize with the liberal left element, it can become a very dangerous racist ideology that believes it must breed a superhuman race that must control all others. This is often mixed with religious mythologies, just as the Nazis try to portray themselves as a chosen divine master race. There, the nature of the mind is not seen as a spectrum in which everything is connected, but separates and classifies individuals into groups and determines their value and rights based on racial and biological characteristics. The mental world has little to do with genetic origin, but is about mental truths that are eternal and would also be true if humanity had never existed. Consciousness could just as well arise on other planets to recognize these truths. And so there have been individuals in different cultures who have recognized these truths and explained them in their own way. They are not eternal genes, but they are recurring mental states and principles that are so universal that they transcend our human world. There is no race of gods that is superior to other races. Anyone who believes this has not understood universality and eternity. On the far right, we find everything that has to do with mind control concepts for the manipulation of consciousness, such as projects like MKUltra. An esoteric far-right ideology that believes in taking the evolution of the mind into its own hands based on the right of the strongest would lead to incredibly barbaric conditions. I am worried that such an ideology will emerge is only a question of how far society has become radicalized and divided, whether the right wing dominates one-sidedly, and whether the masses would be aware of the evolution of the mind. Society is already radicalized. People have also completely lost their sense of what the other wing is actually about and are no longer able to understand the worldview of the other. More division and the right wing is beginning to dominate more and more. And then I'm coming to present the evolution of the mind and why we can't become superhuman. That's why I didn't know whether I should keep all this to myself. But I also have a warning ready and offer a human-friendly alternative that allows the species to grow naturally into the third level without having to give up the ideas of equality, tolerance, openness to the world, and love of the neighbor. In addition, this metaphysics is also in perfect harmony with the fundamental metaphysical structure of reality. Consciousness, which manifests itself one-sidedly in the right-wing elements, is not interested in equality at all, and ideologies based on IQ or similar characteristic will emerge there quite naturally. This is recurring and can manifest itself as small sects, as political racist ideologies, or as religious cults. Also, life is not about reaching the super highest level of consciousness. That is only a small place of possible life experiences. Nor is life about reaching the end of existence as quickly as possible. Whether we all have to sacrifice ourselves so that people are smarter in the future is also only subjective and would only appeal to individuals whose primary essence is in the masculine principle. This would only reinforce division, whereby the feminine perspective would at some point be prepared to use all means to combat the new misanthropic social Darwinism. It would only lead to more chaos breaking out and both sides ending up with even more lives lost, no matter how good it may sound to a one-sided masculine mind. The idea of such ideologies is like the rationalization of the snake on the far right, and it will not work because it is too far removed from the actual dialectical nature of human beings. To explain the situation with morality again. Morality is subjective beyond evolution, and Ted Bundy's morals are neutral next to that of Buddha. Through evolution, however, a species keeps itself in the middle between egoistic self-interest and group interest through empathy. Every time life arises somewhere which asks itself, where am I, who am I, and why does morality exist, the nature of its species will stand between individualism and collectivism. Through evolution, anti-life and psychopathic states of mind become only a marginal phenomenon that cannot prevail in the long term. We feel things are morally right because it is evolutionary profitable. The sense of justice is geared through evolution towards survival and the avoidance of suffering. Suffering is something that arises evolutionary in order to control life subconsciously to avoid certain behavior, in order to ensure survival under the given living conditions. Living conditions produce morality, which changes living conditions, which then produces other morals, which produce other living conditions, and so on. Even if morality is subjective beyond evolution, it can be said that human nature must lie somewhere within the framework of the elements close to the tree in the middle. The division and fall into total chaos only happens because people do not understand it. If they understood it, they would reject the consequences due to their nature and behave differently. So all it would take is enough people to become aware of the nature of morality. People would choose a natural dialectic of political visions due to their subjective nature aligned by evolution. The subconscious of the masses should actually be aligned by evolution to the synthesis in the middle. If people became aware of the evolution of the mind and natural law, I think it would be the only liberal weapon that could prevent the rise of new Darwinian Nazi ideologies. Following the principles of action and reaction, consciousness evolves through moral possibilities, and we are at a point where, instead of falling into vicious ideologies and slaughtering ourselves, we could simply begin to honor the opposition that is on the other side of the tree, and then met under it, to forgive each other and to find solutions.
And when I hang myself on a tree, I saw a girl hanging next to me. So I said in a gentle manner, let's hang together. We walked away from the center of Eden. The apples were rotten, we've eaten. Walking through lifeless like sand. So I grabbed kindly her hand and said, we are the most evil match. All of your family I'll catch. Disgusting, inverted masses. That's all that what your family is. And when I hang myself on a tree, I saw a girl